The U.S. Department of Justice may be on the verge of rolling back some of the most aggressive federal gun regulations of the last several years, and if it happens, it could quietly reshape how gun laws are enforced nationwide. Over the past few weeks, multiple reports have confirmed that DOJ leadership is reviewing existing firearms rules, enforcement policies, and ATF guidance with the goal of scaling back what officials describe as regulatory overreach. This is not a new gun law passed by Congress, and it's not a Supreme Court ruling, but it may end up affecting gun owners just as much. At the center of this review is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Since 2021, the ATF has dramatically expanded its interpretation of federal gun statutes, particularly around private sales, licensing requirements, and firearm definitions. Critics argue the agency went far beyond what Congress authorized, effectively creating new rules through regulation rather than legislation. Now, the DOJ appears to be reconsidering that approach. One of the biggest areas under review involves who is considered engaged in the business of selling firearms. Under current ATF rules, individuals can be required to obtain a federal firearms license even if they only sell a limited number of guns, sometimes from a personal collection. This interpretation has led to enforcement actions against people who believed they were operating fully within the law. According to officials familiar with the DOJ review, this standard may be narrowed, returning closer to the original statutory language passed by Congress. If that happens, fewer private sellers would face the risk of federal prosecution for occasional sales. Another major issue is the ATF's handling of licensing fees and administrative penalties. Over the last few years, license revocations surged, particularly for paperwork violations that did not involve criminal activity. Small gun stores were shut down over technical errors, sometimes without evidence of public harm. The DOJ is now reportedly examining whether those revocations align with due process principles and historical enforcement norms. A shift here could mean fewer zero-tolerance closures and a return to corrective actions instead of immediate license termination. There is also renewed scrutiny of firearm mailing restrictions. Federal rules currently limit how firearms can be shipped, even between lawful owners and licensed dealers. Some DOJ officials are questioning whether these limits are necessary, constitutional, or even effective in preventing crime. While no final decision has been announced, internal discussions reportedly include the possibility of loosening certain mailing rules, particularly for long guns and transfers involving licensed entities. Perhaps most controversially, the DOJ is reviewing policies related to firearm definitions, an area where the ATF has faced repeated court losses. Over the last several years, courts have struck down ATF rules on bump stocks, frames and receivers, and firearm classifications, often citing the Supreme Court's separation of powers rulings. Judges have repeatedly held that agencies cannot rewrite criminal law through regulation. DOJ leadership is now faced with a strategic choice: continue defending regulations that courts keep invalidating, or scale back enforcement to avoid further defeats that could weaken agency authority altogether. This review comes at a time when the Supreme Court has fundamentally changed the legal landscape for gun regulation. Since the Bruin decision, courts are required to evaluate gun laws based on historical tradition, not modern policy goals. That shift has made it far more difficult for agencies to justify expansive interpretations of federal statutes. In practical terms, that means rules once considered settled are now legally vulnerable. The DOJ's reassessment may be an acknowledgement of this reality. Rather than waiting for more adverse rulings, officials may be choosing to pull back voluntarily, reducing legal risk while aligning enforcement with current constitutional standards. It's important to be clear about what this is not. This is not an immediate repeal of federal gun laws. The National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act, and background check requirements remain in place. Congress has not voted to change any statutes. What may change is how aggressively those laws are interpreted and enforced. For gun owners, that distinction matters. Regulatory enforcement determines who gets investigated, who gets charged, and who loses their rights, often without ever seeing a courtroom. If DOJ rolls back these policies, it could mean fewer surprise enforcement actions, clearer rules for compliance, and less uncertainty for lawful owners and dealers. For states, the implications are also significant. Federal enforcement often sets the tone for state-level policies. When the ATF expands its reach, states frequently follow with similar interpretations. A federal pullback could slow or reverse that trend. Gun control advocates, however, are already raising alarms. They argue that any rollback weakens public safety and undermines federal oversight. Some groups are urging DOJ officials to maintain aggressive enforcement even in the face of court challenges. But critics respond that constitutional limits are not optional, and that agencies do not get to decide policy outcomes simply because Congress failed to act. This debate ultimately comes down to power. Who writes the rules, Congress, the courts, or federal agencies? The DOJ review suggests that question is no longer theoretical. Whether these changes move forward will depend on internal decisions, political pressure, and legal strategy. Some reforms may happen quietly through guidance updates rather than public announcements. Others could face immediate backlash. But one thing is clear: federal gun policy is shifting, not through headlines or legislation, but through the slow recalibration of enforcement authority. For gun owners, dealers, and anyone following Second Amendment law, this is a development worth watching closely, because sometimes the biggest changes happen not when a law is passed, but when the government decides how or whether to enforce it.